For whom that knows me a bit more, probably they know how fond I am for Barbera. Barbera used to be considered like the, the wine for the poor people, no? The Barolo, the Nebbiolo is the grave variety of the king, and the Barbera is the grave variety of like the everyday type of wine. Barbera and Dolcetto. I would say the Barbera is the complex version of Dolcetto, even if Dolcetto could be incredible, depends where you're producing it. We are actually thinking about buying a vineyard in Diano d'Alba, and this vineyard will be maybe run by Flavio Sobrero or even at Simone Scaletta. They're going to help us to make our own wine. But Barbera to me is incredible because, first of all, it used to be one of the most common grape variety of Italy. Up to the 19th century, we can find in the register of the vineyards that Barbera used to be planted all over north of Italy. We even have a little enclave of Barbera in Campania, which is a completely different type of wine as what we consider. You know that I'm not a varietal person in the sense that to me a Barbera is strongly related with the place, so it's linked with a local tradition and a climate and the soil. The idea of the varietal wines has been an idea only of the last 30, 40 years, mainly imported by New World. It was easier for the New World to promote the grape variety than a place, while in Italy we started to talk about grape varieties in the way we talk it only in the last 30, 40 years. Before it was more about regions. If you think about most of the wines we talk about, their name in Italy is not naming a grape variety. Chianti is a region, Montalcino is a village, Barolo is a village, Barbaresco is a village, and Valdobbiadene is a village again. And so varietal, it's not as important as the place where it's coming from. Technically, I don't like to distinguish the two things. In specific case here, we're talking about Barbera d'Alba. Usually we have three main Barbera in that area. There's Barbera del Monferrato, Barbera d'Asti, and Barbera d'Alba. Again, trying to give a general idea what Barbera is comparing from the place where it's coming from. I would say that Barbera d'Asti tend to have a slightly higher acidity and a bit more earthiness. Monferrato, again, a bit more acidity. Barbera d'Alba, as an average, is slightly softer. But again, this is really depending on a philological approach you have with the grape variety, because, for example, Barbera, if you see the map of the Barbera and Dolcetto of the 50s in the Langhe area, they used to plant Barbera in the most noble area beside the Nebbiolo. In the last 30, 40 years, they decided to plant the Barbera in the lower part of the valley. And so the quality of the Barbera became a bit more flat because it's interesting how, for example, in the Langhe area, Cabernet, Sauvignon, and Chardonnay and Merlot are planted in the worst part of the vineyard, you know? And so what are considered in the New World the noble grape variety in Langhe are not. And of course, because they want to privilege to the best area to the Nebbiolo. There are a few producers that decided not to sacrifice the vineyard of Barbera, and I would count in this specific case Giacomo alias Roberto Conterno. They still make the Barbera Cascina Francia, it is possibly one of my favorite Barbera. It's getting really pricey, but it's really good. And one was actually the one from the Gabutti, for example, from Cappellano. So producers that decide, or the Bricoboschis from Cavallotto. So winemakers that decided not to get rid of the vineyard of Barbera in order to plant a Nebbiolo. So, talking about the winemakers, Simone Scaletta, I mean that this premise is that, you know, Barbera, this is one of the few winemakers that decided to keep the Barbera where it is. Another one that I really like is Cascina delle Rose. They make this Barbera Vigna Elena, which is incredible. And so winemakers that decided that even though they're not going to make a lot of money with this grape variety, not as much as calling this wine Barolo or Barbaresco, they didn't decide to get rid of that vineyard and to plant the Nebbiolo. And he also has an incredible vineyard of Dolcetto. I think he was in the wine club last year. We're going to put it again in a couple of years, or maybe next year, which is a vineyard that is more than 90 years old. Dolcetto Biglioni, I think is his name. And in this specific case, we're talking about a winemaker that is in Monforte d'Alba. Monforte d'Alba is one of the 11 villages allowed to call their wine Barolo. And his story is incredible. His grandfather used to own a vineyard there, and then he sold the vineyard at the beginning of the mid of the 70s. So when he was younger, Simona went to work. I think he was in a printing. He had like a little business of printing books and so on in Turin, and his dream was coming back to the vineyard of his grandfather. But every year he was deciding to come back in the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s. The price of the vineyard was going high and high and high. And so he really didn't have the money because the gentrification in that area is crazy. You have to think that probably an acre of vineyard at the beginning of the 70s was probably $5,000. Today is almost $1 million. So how even more than an apartment in New York, well, almost as much as an apartment in New York. So it happens that most of the locals, they didn't have the money to buy their own land. But he was so convinced that at a certain point, every year he was saving the money. But there was always something missing the money to buy a house. So at the end, he had the money of the vineyard, but not for the house for living in. So he lived in a caravan for a couple of years until he had the money. So he sacrificed himself in order to go back to his grandfather vineyard. Voila, this is beautiful. And immediately, what I like about Barbera, when you actually had this perception when the fruit and the acidity are all in one, especially when you smell it, you immediately get that you have this nice plummy flavor on one side, but on the other side you had this something crispy, something spicy that makes your palate salivating even if you didn't taste it yet. This is nice and round and nice and crispy at the same time. The main issue is about when we talk about wine. I mean, I don't like rules in tasting, but there's one simple rule is about having a balance in your palate, so that your palate is not driven too much on one side. When driven too much on one side, especially when we talk about some of the new world wines or the modern or the supermarket wines, for example, they tend to be more too fruity, too oaky, too on one side. Barbera is a perfect example of a wine that is able to be on both sides. You know, this nice crispy finish with a nice fruity flavor. The perfect pairing with Barbera for me is the salami. This is Mafalda. I'm afraid that if you want to find this salami, you have to come here in Rome at Rimessa Roscioli. I think that you can go all night long. Slice of salami, some good stories to tell, and a nice Barbera to pair. Thank you.